A delicate balancing act. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte courts Chinese investment amid tensions in the South China Sea. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte walking a tightrope with his fifth visit to China, a diplomatic charm offensive to keep Chinese money rolling into his country. Duterte's China pivot, however, isn't a big hit with Filipinos back home. They want Duterte to challenge China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, while his diplomatic overtures may be unpopular. Duterte's approval rating is nearly 80%, due in part to the government's anti-crime campaign, including the controversial war on drugs, a violent crackdown on alleged drug dealers and users in which thousands of people have been killed. To discuss all of this, I want to bring in our panel. Here with us in Washington is Lucio Blanco Pitlo III. He's a research fellow at the Asia-Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation. Camille Elamir covers Philippine politics for news site Rappler. She joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Sourabh Gupta joins us on set. He's resident senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. Welcome to all of you to the show. Lucio, let's start here in the studio. President Duterte has made 5 visits to China. This is his 8th meeting, actually, with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. He's yet to visit the United States or any other major Western capital. Seems diplomatically a shift towards China. How would you characterize the relationship between China and the Philippines right now?
Well, as you said, this goes to show the number of visits he made to Beijing so far is indicative of the relations that he wants to send a message to China that this bilateral relations is very important for the Philippines. China has become the largest trade partner of the Philippines since 2016, its largest investor last year. And this year, it's projected that they may become the country's largest tourism market. So I think economics is very much a major driver in this number of visits. And so he needs to manage the disputes because these territorial and maritime disputes will always affect the way he wants to do economic dealings with China. So he has to manage the disputes so as to expand the other aspects of the relations.
So it's quite a balancing act for him.
It is, and it is a tough one.
All right, let me bring in Camille Elamir. She's in Arizona. Camille, the South China Morning Post describes the Philippines-China relationship as a, quote, strategic romance. And certainly there are differences between China and the Philippines, especially on the South China Sea issues. But there are other reports which say that President Duterte has tied the Philippines' future to China. How do you see it?
Well, many Filipinos view the diplomatic policy of President Duterte as someone that's more advantageous to China. But at the same time, Filipinos also more or less understand that there are bigger issues than the maritime dispute. But I think what they're after, what they want to see from the president is to fight for the sovereignty. So now this is like, we have to closely watch President Duterte's actions in terms of U.S. and China, especially on the South China Sea, because whatever actions he will do will tilt the balance of power in the region.
Can you explain that to us? How would the relationship between the United States and China, specifically on the South China Sea, influence how the Philippines behaves?
No, it's more of like the Philippines has been a traditional ally of the United States. And there was a recent survey showing that majority of Filipinos distrust China. And it stems primarily because generations of Filipinos have grown for lack of better term, loving the Americans, and they're used to the presence of Americans in the Philippines. But what I'm saying right now is President Duterte's independent foreign policy, in that the Philippines veers away from the U.S. and becomes closer to China, will shift the balance of power in the region because many Southeast Asian nations view America as someone who can go at par with China in terms of strength, in terms of influence in the region. It's not more of like the relation of China and U.S. affecting the Philippines' stand on the issue.
Camille Elemaire makes a great point there that there has been a long relationship between the Philippines and the United States that goes back decades. Is that changing?
Yes, that is changing, but I would argue that it's Philippines' relationship with China is the one which is the mercurial one. We have President Duterte now, who's taken a very enabling stance towards China, but that was also the stance of President Arroyo in the 2000s. And then we had, after President Arroyo, we had President Aquino, who took a markedly different stance on China. So I would say it's the Philippine stance on China which has swung like a pendulum this way or the other, while the stance on the US has, I would say, by and large been roughly stable.
Right, let's look at the point of dispute between China and the Philippines. It's the South China Sea. And before he left to go to China, President Duterte said he intends raising that issue with the President of China, President Xi Jinping. And we know that the arbitration court at the UN ruled in favor of the Philippines. Beijing has not acknowledged that ruling. And this is what a spokesman at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing had to say. Let's watch this.
The countries in the region have the will, wisdom, and ability to properly handle the South China Sea issue and achieve long-term stability, development, and prosperity in the region. Under this circumstance, some countries outside the region ignore the efforts by regional countries to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea, and deliberately fueled tensions on relevant issues by making irresponsible remarks. We oppose such practices.
So at a time when the Philippines is looking to improve relations with China, why raise this issue now?
The Philippines, for the Chinese side, they have been kind of upset with this fact that ever since the arbitration case ended, a new chapter in China-ASEAN and China-Philippine relations has opened up, but the United States has kept harping on things like freedom of navigation, on the arbitration, to try to foul that environment up. I think China and the Philippines are going in a great direction, including, I will submit, on the South China Sea. We hear about, yes, President Xi said that we do not accept the arbitration, but what we are actually going to see in the coming months is on one of the most controversial issues in the arbitration, which is development of oil and gas resources.
Right.
We are intelligently going to have an agreement which does not violate the arbitration, does not violate Philippines constitution, and yet goes forward with cooperative development. That is a very difficult needle to thread, and China and Philippines are doing that.
Lucio, go ahead.
So there is, of course, understandable pressure, domestic from the Philippine side for Duterte to actually raise and be more assertive, more forceful in terms of trying to find ways to get China on board in implementing the ruling.
Okay.
But of course, that is very difficult considering China's position on this matter. So both sides will have to find a way to try to pacify their domestic audiences, while at the same time trying to convince their domestic publics and the international community that they are finding ways to actually manage the disputes and push for practical cooperation, including on resource cooperation. So I think the discussion on the proposed joint oil and gas development is along these lines. Right. But of course, recent incidents like what happened last June, when unfortunate incident when a Filipino fishing vessel was hit by a Chinese vessel, and of course there's reported interference and intimidation on Filipino fishing and maritime economic activities in their exclusive economic zone. So of course there's pressure on Duterte to take this up with his Chinese counterpart, prevent these scenarios from taking place moving forward, and at the same time try to push for the conclusion, the early conclusion of preferably favorably a legally binding code of conduct.
Okay. All right, let me bring in Einar Tangen. He's in Beijing. Einar, let's talk about this relationship. There certainly is a big trade and economic component to the relationship between China and the Philippines. But looking at the South China Sea issue, is that a big obstacle to improving relations?
Not really. I mean, as has been pointed out by my colleagues, this is an opportunity to thread the needle. Joint cooperations, especially on things like oil and gas, which will be beneficial to both sides, are exactly the way through this. And I would imagine that this will be China's approach going forward in other disputed areas. perhaps even in Vietnam. You know, the issue here is Duterte might not be politically correct, but he is taking care of things at home, maybe not in the way the international community would respect or admire, but as you pointed out, he has an 80% or thereabouts approval rating. But the second part is, Philippines has been growing at close to 7% since 2012. Very impressive numbers. He wants to keep that going, and he understands that economically, the game is with China, not with the U.S.
Right. Einar, China, of course, is taking a much longer-term view of the relationship with the Philippines. This is what President Xi Jinping had to say on that. Let's watch this.
I'm willing to work with Mr. President to grasp the current situation and the trend for the long-term strategic view and lead the development of our bilateral relations. This will not only benefit our two countries and our peoples, but will also provide positive energy to the region that we are located in.
So, Einar, how do you see this relationship moving forward from here?
Well, as I said, the joint economic parts of it is, but let us be frank. You know, the U.S. has a series of allies, and they've been using Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc., to kind of light little fires around China and contain China through this Freedom of Navigation Acts. China views those as hostile. To have a friend, or at least an ally, somebody who is aiming the same direction, e.g. the Philippines, breaking that kind of you know, circle that was going on, is very much to China's benefit. It also stands to the Philippines' benefit because they want to continue growing. Everybody knows that there are dark days. Winter is coming, as they say, with a recession, and they want to be prepared.
Sourabh, looking at this strategically, how would President Duterte's outreach to China be seen here in the United States? You know, as we pointed out, the United States has for long been an ally of the Philippines, not just a treaty ally, but as the Philippines analyst Richard Hedarian pointed out in a piece in the South China Morning Post, it's also a non-NATO major ally.
Absolutely. It's been seen very negatively in the United States, but they do know, Mr. President Duterte is very popular back home. Secondly, he is going to be here for a 6-year period. They have a one-term presidency. He just won a resounding mandate, not him, but his folks in the elections. And so what they have done is lowered their voices on this front and are just trying to tide out this period while maintaining those connections with the defense establishment, which is still pretty pro-America. And so that's the way America has proceeded. They were very disappointed, of course, when President Duterte was elected itself, because that coincided with the arbitration award, and the U.S. was using the arbitration award as a tool with which an instrument to really hammer China on the head. But if Mr. Duterte is not going to push and wants to suspend the effects of the arbitration award, U.S. can just do so much and not that much more. So they have been unhappy about it, but given that, as you said, they are a non-NATO ally, you don't want to have a complete rupture, and so they've been maintaining that.
I'll get you in a moment. Camille, how do you see it? Is President Duterte not going to put all his eggs in one basket when it comes to his foreign policy and maintain good relations with China? There are, of course, trade and economic advantages to that, but at the same time maintain a good strategic relationship with the United States.
Yes, as you earlier said, it's a delicate balance act. And what will happen most likely is that while President Duterte has personal ties with the Chinese government, with the Chinese businessmen, the establishment, military, businessmen are still used to the American way. So that's how he has to balance that. And at the same time, while the Philippines will greatly benefit from the economic development or the economic advantages that China will bring to our country, we cannot deny the fact that the effect or the advantage of U.S. is multidimensional, and that they have long established cultural exchanges in the Philippines. Their movies are in the Philippines. Their business influence is there. So it will not be easy for the Filipino people to completely forget that. But at the same time, we have to be welcoming of the economic advantages that China will bring.
Okay, Lucio, you want to say something? Yeah.
So there's no question that Duterte sees China as a potentially transformative economic partner for the Philippines. And we also see China's interest and willingness to actually expand areas of cooperation with the Philippines, going beyond economics and looking at security. For instance, in the field of counterterrorism and the support on the war against drugs by donation of drug rehabilitation centers. But this said, U.S. is and remains the Philippines' security ally. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. And of course, we see recent developments like the first U.S.-ASEAN maritime exercises, where Philippines took part. Last June, USS Montgomery made a port visit in Davao. U.S. provided support to the establishment of a counterterrorism training facility inside the Philippine National Police Academy. So there might be some bad optics, some bad rhetorics, but I think on the main, security and defense ties between the Philippines and the U.S. remains robust and firmly established. And I don't think Duterte will upend it. He has personal issues with the West. You know, he's anti-colonial, he's anti-Western posturing. But I think he understands that at the end of the day, you still need a counterbalance to make sure that some kind of hedge against potential adverse impact of an expanding influence of China, not only in the Philippines, but also in Southeast Asia.
Right. Einar Tangen, one more point on this relationship. It seems very ambivalent. How will Beijing be looking at this? On the one hand, President Duterte wanting these better economic and trade relations with China, but at the same time, as Lucio just pointed out, seeing the United States as its chief security ally.
Well, quite frankly, Beijing is just as realistic as Duterte is. And quite frankly, everybody knows the very strong and long attachment to the U.S. All of the countries will continue, in my estimation, to keep some sort of security arrangement with the U.S. while trying to figure out how they can do trade with China. That just makes practical sense. But what China does not want is hostile aircraft carriers anchored off their coast being used by the U.S. in a menacing manner. So to the extent that China can blunt this kind of aggression, they will. This is part of why they created the Belt and Road Initiative, and it is absolutely essential in their mind to making sure that the resources that China needs in order to create value-added products for consumption at home and also export are maintained.
Camille, let's turn to domestic politics. President Duterte, as we are all aware, has been criticized, very harshly criticized at times for his war on drugs. And Human Rights Watch issued a report in which it said that more than 12,000 people, many of them low income from very poor areas, have been killed in that war. What is your assessment of his very tough policies on the war on drugs? And you have to measure that against the fact that crime is down 20% in Philippines, and his approval rating, as we mentioned earlier, is up 80%.
So President Duterte's bloody drug war is one of the if not the very controversial issue hounding his administration now. So it's a polarizing issue, with many of his supporters saying that streets in Manila and in the Philippines are safer now. But critics and third-party organizations say that the number of killed have reached 30,000, but government data show it's below 10,000. But we have to point out that it's not Filipinos are overwhelmingly accepting of that. It's generally the sentiment, but I'd like to point out that there was a time when the ratings of President Duterte take a hit. This was after an innocent 17-year-old kid was killed by the police. Policemen said he fought back, but CCTV showed that it wasn't the case. So after that, President Duterte listened to public sentiment and tried to tame down his bloody drug war. So he ordered the police to calm down, and at the same time to follow the rules of engagement. But at the same time, right now, President Duterte has recovered. As you all know, he got an overwhelming vote of support for his senatorial candidates in the last elections, and generally, with the current state of the war on drugs, Filipinos have remained approving of that.
Right. Is it the war on drugs and the manner in which he is conducting that war, or is it something else that has given him these very high approval ratings, Camille?
I think it could be a part. It could be one of the reasons, because before this, Filipinos have always been plagued with issues of security in the streets. But I think what works now is that the drug war has reached a point where it has already recovered from the issues of mass murders, especially of innocent teenagers or minors. But before that, when it happened, it really took a hit. The ratings of President Duterte took a hit, but now he knows better how to navigate the issue.
Right. Lucio, what do you make of these tough policies? I mean, in some places, these have been called crimes against humanity.
Sure. So I think that the challenge for Duterte administration in one of his flagship areas, which is security and peace and order, safety on the streets, so the drug war is very much an integral part of that. Even during the campaign, he said that it will be one of the centerpiece of his administration.
Right.
And he said that despite of the criticisms, the campaign against illegal drugs in the country will remain unrelenting and unremitting as in day one. So we don't see it changing anytime soon. What I feel should be reformed would be greater emphasis on the health and the rehabilitation aspect of the drug campaign. Duterte's administration oversaw the construction of the largest drug rehabilitation center in the Philippines. And more were constructed in other areas like Mindanao. And of course, China is also playing a part in this. And so convincing the people, that law enforcement aspect, where killings are taking place, how to prosecute those who did not follow or comply with the standard protocols, and bringing to justice, those erring policemen and those who are in cahoots with drug kingpins, And on the one hand, ensuring that for drug users who surrendered and who wants to have a renewed life, there's an option for you. I think 300,000 drug users, drug addicts, are underwent, rehabilitation programs. Half of this were from the Philippine National Police initiated renewal programs. This, of course, are less publicized. So I think government has to do more in terms of public relations, telling the people that the law enforcement aspect is there. It's getting a lot of news, but at the same time, there's also another dimension that also deserves to be discussed.
Okay. Sourabh, looking at these very tough policies that have been adopted by President Duterte, a lot of that criticism has come from here, from the United States. Yet, he has a very cordial relationship with President Trump. And if you look at their style of governing, their rhetoric to a large extent, are they cut from the same cloth?
Perhaps they are cut from the same cloth. And yeah, that's an interesting comparison. And yes, there's been a lot of talk about how Trump has been in favor of authoritarians. But the dimension I would like to point out here with regard to President Duterte is, and it's not just about President Duterte only, we see in ex-President Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, we see in Narendra Modi in India, these were provincial leaders. They were not part of the central establishment. They built their political mandates in fighting that central establishment. And even to an extent, President Joko Widodo. And these are provincial leaders who've been raised up to the pedestal of becoming central leaders. Maybe they don't have that sophistication and suaveness of the central leaders and that central policy establishment, but they know how to get things done both regionally, and they've taken many of those of their toolkit to the center. Now, I'm not trying to do this to justify this. At the end of the day, you just don't use any means to reach the end that you choose. But these are a different breed of leaders, and have brought a different breed of leadership to national government. And I think that's an important dimension.
So you're saying that President Duterte is in touch with the problems that the Philippine people face?
The problems that the Philippines face, and different means of how he sees that he will tackle these problems, which he feels has a broad, a silent but broad consensus across the nation.
Einar Tangen, we read and we hear a lot these days about a changing world, about these shifts of power balances being changed as well. If you look at the Philippines, it's a major Asian country with a population of more than 104 million people. What role do you see for the Philippines as Asia begins to have a greater say in what takes place in the world?
Well, at the present rate of growth, which is over 6%, it'll be 6% this year, following last year. That's a projection. They have the opportunity to kind of move their economy forward, but they need a lot of infrastructure. Right now, almost 10% of their GDP is based on remittances, money earned overseas by Filipinos and sent home. Tourism is an issue, is an opportunity, but they need the infrastructure. So it all comes down to investment, and where can that come from? For the infrastructure projects, obviously, China would be a very good source for that. They know how to do it, get it done, organize it very quickly. And then also, Chinese businesses would be a great opportunity. Remember, there's China itself is becoming too expensive for a lot of industries, and especially in textiles and even motorcycle and lower-end manufacturing. That could be to the Philippines' benefit. They have the labor dividend. Right. It would give people their factories. Remember, the Philippines was, just after the war, the second richest country in the Asian Pacific, and they could be once again.
Camille, one final point I want to raise with you, and that is you're a journalist. You work for the news website Rappler, and the founder and editor of Rappler, Maria Ressa, is an outspoken critic of President Duterte and his policies, especially his drug policies. In fact, she's posted bail something like 8 times. There's currently a warrant out on cyber libel charges. What is it about Rappler's reporting that so angers the Philippines president?
I think it's more about the investigations into his bloody drug war that irked the president. The campaign against illegal drugs is something really close to the president because he has been doing that since he was a mayor in Davao City in Mindanao. So we believe that it triggered the hatred or the anger of President Duterte.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.